Okay, now we have Detective Brian Clarke from Arlington Heights Police Department. He's got a couple back-to-back presentations for us today. The first one's from mapping to mugshot. It's about an armed robbery analysis, and then law enforcement's cell phone analysis using the ArcGIS cell phone analysis toolkit.
Good morning. Happy GIS Day. I'm going to do my best to stay close to this microphone, but that's probably not going to happen. So if you can't hear me, let me know. I'll remind me to shoo myself back over here. See if my remote works here. All right. So I'm Investigator Brian Clarke. I'm with the Arlington Heights Police Department. Been in law enforcement about 15 years, but I do come from a GIS background. I'm also assigned to MCAT, which is a 23-town homicide task force in northwestern Cook County. Part of the reason that I agreed to do these talks is I kind of consider myself an ambassador for law enforcement, to reach out to GIS people to get help with their mapping. And a lot of people think the police departments haven't been doing mapping for a long time. So I like to start my presentations with a little bit of history of just how long we've been doing it. This map on the left here is from 1829. It's comparing crime versus education. It's believed to be the first crime-related map. It's also the first use of a shaded map to portray crime rates. Map on the left here again in France is suicides, and it's one of the things we see throughout history, and I have a couple examples in this presentation. We were very interested in mapping suicide, and I don't know what the reason of that was. Again, France here, this is crimes against persons, 1864. It's comparing the number of persons executed by the crimes per month, trying to make the correlation that if we kill more criminals, crime will decrease. Not my opinion, not my opinion. Across the pond here in England, again around the same time, 1840s, 1850s, a couple interesting maps here. This one's titled Ignorance in England and Wales. On the left here, don't exactly know what the cohorts are there. The map in the middle here is persons committed for keeping disorderly houses. I think that's referring to the cleanliness of your home. Those are houses of prostitution. And on the right, even in 1862, we were concerned with the locations of sex offenders because their recidivism rate is oftentimes higher than other types of criminals. This map is titled Persons Committed for Carnally Abusing Girls Between the Ages of 10 and 12. Across the pond in San Francisco, about 1885, this map is titled The Official Map of Chinatown in San Francisco. It's color-coded for the locations of several things, including houses of gambling, houses of prostitution, and something at the time that they called opium resorts or heroin dens. Up the coast, Seattle, again, you see a map of suicide in 1914, 1925. Gentleman on the left, longtime head of the Federal Bureau of Investigation, J. Edgar Hoover, who was a big proponent of cartography. More locally here, Minnesota, this is the 1930s. We're looking at a series of murders. And even more locally here in Chicago, a couple of good examples. This one's from 1929. It's the home addresses of alleged male juvenile delinquents. It's very difficult to deal with juvenile criminal data these days. We would never get the permission to produce a map like that anymore. Crime mapping using GIS really took off in the late 1990s. If any of you were involved in the Compass project, it basically was the first attempt to make crime data available to the public. And they chose 3 locations throughout the United States: Seattle, Washington, Redlands, California, and Milwaukee, Wisconsin, where I happened to be a graduate student at the time, how I got involved in law enforcement. Crime mapping has become so important, the city of New York became the first to statutorily require their agency to produce a monthly crime map. They saw the value in it very early on. Which brings us to where we are today. So 19 armed or attempted armed robberies was a problem that we were facing, committed in our 11 northwestern Cook and Lake County municipalities between October 31st and May 7th. Just to clarify, we often use the terms burglary and robbery incorrectly. In the state of Illinois, you rob a person and you burglarize a building. So in this instance here, we had an individual that entered a business, either implied or presented a weapon, demanded something in return. So I just want to make sure we're all on the same page. In the first of the Sherlock Holmes books, there's a quote that reads, "There's a strong family resemblance about misdeeds. If you have all the details at your finger's end, it's odd if you can't unravel the 1,001st. It's kind of the fundamental principle of crime analysis, what I do. If you study how offenders have behaved in the past, you can predict how he's going to behave in the future. One of the first things we look at is places, right? Place is important to us as geographers. So we mapped where all the crimes were occurring, and each by community here. Arlington Heights, where I work, 3. A couple of the other towns, Lake Bluff, 1. Lake Zurich, 1. Prospect Heights, 4. You'll see how that becomes important later. We'll talk about that. And just a rough map of where those cities are located. So at the time, we had a very vague suspect description that wasn't much use to our police officers. We had a male white between 20 to 30 years old, 6 feet tall, short brown hair, dark jacket, baseball hat, gym shoes. He oftentimes carried a black semi-automatic handgun, which he presented with his right hand. That doesn't give me a whole lot, right? We're one of the 3rd or 4th largest metropolitan areas in the United States. For me to give my guys this doesn't give them much to work with. But one of the things that was important to us is in every one of the cases, he spoke with a very strong Polish or Russian accent. A lot of the techniques I'm going to show you here today are important that we isolate that is being committed by the same person. We may have 2 or 3 series of crimes going on at once, but for some of the tools I'm going to talk about today, we have to make sure that it's the same person's data that we're analyzing. And in one of the cases, we think that we had him driving a dark-colored minivan. So we brought in 3 different forensic sketch artists that interviewed the victims, who gave 3 composite drawings, which you'll see here. I think that strengthened the case that we were dealing with the same individual. At the time, I was relatively new at this, so I ran to my chief and said, I've identified him. I know who it is. I don't remember the quote, but it was something along the lines of "beat it, GIS nerd," but it was something like that. So strengthen the idea that this is the same guy that's doing all of these, right? One of the first things we do is we compile all the data, and this is just a quick data matrix here: address, city, type of location, day, date, and time, and day, week, things that are very important to crime analysis and determining patterns. This one here in the middle is called DBH, or days between hits. Today's Wednesday, for example. If I were to commit a crime today and then wait 2 days and commit another crime on Friday, my days between hits is 2, okay? Well, you see those numbers initially are very large, right? He commits one crime and then he waits in hiding for 2 months. He commits another crime and he waits for a month. So you see these numbers generally in a downward trend, which means that he's becoming increasingly active. He's committing more crimes. He's getting better at his craft, right? One of the jobs of a crime analyst is kind of like a handler for a canine. It's to get my guys the scent of the criminal and send them on their way. Right now, we don't have much, right? We have a vague description and a rough area. It's my job to narrow that down, give them as much information as they need to get them out on the streets to catch this guy. There's a little bit of math coming, I promise, but if I can do it, so can you. So we just look at a couple things here. Day of week's very important to us. When is he committing these crimes? You look at almost exclusively Wednesdays and Thursdays, about 67%. That's good. That's the first thing that I can narrow down. Hey, fellas, Wednesdays and Thursdays, we got to start looking for this guy. Okay? So we continue to try to narrow that down as much as we can. We look at times of day. That's on the next slide. We look at mean days between hits. So on average, he's striking about every week and a half. Okay? So we look at times almost exclusively on the right-hand side here. He's hitting between 6 and 9 p.m. Important. Hey, fellas, Wednesdays and Thursdays, 6 to 9 p.m. This guy's going to strike again in about a week and a half. Okay? So we always look at what types of businesses these crimes are being committed against. Gas stations and convenience stores, those top 2 are pretty common. Okay, we inappropriately refer to those as stop and robs because they're so frequently the targeted of crime. But Aldi's kind of unique. We had 18 of these for 2 of them to be at an Aldi. Interesting. It's not a type of place that's typically robbed, so it got to a point where we were mapping the locations of all the Aldis, calling towns that had Aldi stores. This European deli is also pretty unique. It's in a very discrete location. It's about half the size of the stage, and we'll get to that in a subsequent slide, how that becomes important. So again, recapping where we're at so far, male white, 6 feet tall, light brown hair, spoke Polish accent. He's typically going to strike against a gas station or convenience store, Wednesdays and Thursdays, 7 and 9 p.m., surrounding jurisdictions. Still too big of an area, right? I still can't direct my force to go find this guy, right? As the graphic, which I stole from Esri, says, without maps, we're spatially blind. I got to narrow that area where we're looking for this guy down. So one of the ways we do that, and one of the theories of criminology, is something that's called an anchor point. And that anchor point is typically where we live, work, or play. It's where a criminal leaves from in the morning to go and commit their crime, and where they return to at the end of the day. And the frequency of offending decreases as the distance from the anchor point increases. in English, I'm going to commit more crimes around my house, or where I spend most of my time, because I know that area, than I am in a distance farther away, okay? So typically in this country, we see two types of criminals if we were to be forced to break them down into two models. The first is what's called a commuter model, and that's somebody that leaves his home range, travels some distance to a range where he's going to commit his crimes. These types of criminals are very rare and very difficult to catch. We think historically of some of the more notable serial killers that were over-the-road truck drivers or traveling businessmen. These are the types of commuter criminals, very rare. The second type of criminal we usually deal with is a marauder, and that's a person that commits crimes around his house because he knows that area. He knows how to escape. He knows what's open late at night. He knows it might have a poor security system. For those of you that are movie buffs, you may remember a scene in The Silence of the Lambs where convicted serial killer Dr. Hannibal Lecter is having some dialogue with FBI Special Agent Clarice Starling, in which he says, "What does he do, this man you seek?" And she replies, "He kills women." And he says, "No, he covets. That is his nature." And how do we begin to covet? Do we seek out things to covet? And he says, "No, we begin by coveting what we see every day." Hannibal Lecter was describing a marauder-type criminal. One of the ways that we're going to narrow down that search area is through a process called geographic profiling. Geographic profiling was developed in Canada in the late 80s. First used by the Vancouver Police Department in the mid-1990s. And they tested the theories of geographic profiling based on data of shark attacks against seals. Criminals behave like animals. They hunt and they gather. They prey on the weak. For those of you GIS dinosaurs like myself in here, you may remember in the late 1990s, the USGS released a set of tools called the Animal Movement and Tracking Extension. It's one of the best sets of crime analysis tools that we've ever had. And those are some of the first tools that we use to study how criminals behaved and how they identified their targets. So one of the first maps we make is where are these crimes? And the crimes are obviously the yellow circles with the black ski masks there. The red numbers to the upper right are the number in the sequence. So you'll see, for example, this was the first. Then he traveled some distance, second, third. But relatively speaking, they're all pretty clustered here. Later in the series, you see the person traveling a farther distance away. He's basically figured out, oh boy, I've done too many in this neighborhood. I need to get out of here and go a little bit further distance away. That strengthens the idea that this was a marauder that we were looking for, that we need to focus our efforts in the middle, right, near that anchor point. So one of the second maps we do is just called the standard distance. It's trying to predict where this offender is going to strike again. Remember back to Sherlock Holmes. If we study how they behaved in the past, it's odd if we can't understand how they're going to behave in the future. So this, just one standard deviation, is this interior ring here. Does that narrow down our search area? Sure. Is it still too big? Yeah. So one of the next things we do is use a process called the standard deviation ellipse, and that looks for any linear directional trends in the data. You can clearly see that this runs from the northwest to southeast, which mirrors two major thoroughfares in northwestern Cook County, Rand Road, which is Highway 12, and Northwest Highway, which is Highway 14, which happen to run right through Arlington Heights. This individual was using those roads to travel to these crimes. I'm going to jump ahead here, but that green star is where he lives. Is that a marauder? You bet it is. One of the next things we do is called the arithmetic centroid, trying to narrow down the center point of that location, trying to identify that anchor point. If I'm going to go to my chief and say, I need all the police officers, and I need them to change their schedule, and I need to change where they're going to work, I better have some supporting data to that. So I'm trying to strengthen the idea that this is a marauder, and he's near this anchor point with my data. So we look at here, using the Esri tools over a course of about 8 months, this crime series took over 36 square miles. The anchor point was here on this blow up. He lived 0.8 of a mile from that. Pretty cool. One of the subsequent maps we do is just to calculate mean distance, basically how far from that anchor point on average he's willing to travel. So about 4.5 miles from that anchor point. So now I can go back to say, listen, I want to focus all my efforts in about a 4.5 mile area. Again, along major thoroughfares, Highway 12, Highway 14, Wednesdays and Thursdays, 7 to 9, gas stations. One of the things that we can look at is a process called sequential analysis. So if I have my first crime is here, next week it's here, next week it's here, the fourth week it's going to be, you're all detectives, right? But in this case, it actually didn't help us out. He was all over the place. right? He's back and forth. He waits 22 days, for example, goes here. He waits 1 day and goes here. He waits another day and goes here. So in this case, it really didn't help us, and that's okay. But again, strengthens the idea that in this mess, he's going to be there somewhere. One of the things we can look at is victims. What type of victims are they going after? And this is often what we use in a serial rapist case or a robber that's robbing people out on the street. Why are they going after those people? This is an opinion that's not mine, but some male offenders believe that females make better victims. And I believe that's the case here. Most of the people in his home range, right, where he lives, that he committed these crimes against were females. It's only when he left that range that he encountered males. And in several of those instances, because he wasn't a good criminal, he went in there, presented a weapon, and was either chased off or told no. So he wasn't successful, which again strengthens the idea he's somewhere over here. This is just the jurisdictional outline of Arlington Heights. I'm trying to make the argument that this guy's in our town a lot. He's using transportation networks that take him through our town. This is something called the spatial temporal moving average. So basically, if I have a series of crimes between crime 1 and crime 2, I'm going to create that arithmetic centroid. Let's say the average distance is here. He commits another crime. So now I have 3 pieces of data, 1, 2, and 3. Now the average moves a little bit. Now I have 4 crimes. Now the average moves a bit. It's basically an average that's continually being adjusted as crimes happen. And what you see here is that average keeps moving back to that home point. Another piece of data that gives me some credence with my chief. This guy is here. He's close to us. So this is Canine Officer Jim McGrath. Jim had just completed a tour in our problem-oriented policing unit where our crime analysis is located. So Jim was a proponent of GIS and crime mapping. So Jim took these maps that we made and said, I'm going to find this guy. And he did. In Cook County, it's oftentimes difficult to get a criminal charge on a lot of crimes unless you catch them in the act. So we knew that would be the case here. So we assembled a very large surveillance team, and after we identified who this person was, he was surveilled for a period of time until he went 33 miles from his house on a Wednesday evening, a little bit out of his time range, right, because traffic in Chicago is terrible, where he committed an armed robbery, which ultimately led to a car chase where he was throwing cash out the vehicle window. So this is Pyotr Jaworowski. He was ultimately charged with 14 of the armed robberies. He was sentenced to 11 years in the Illinois Department of Corrections, as such is normally the case. He only served about half of that time. He was released a few years ago. I'm told he was deported back to his native Poland. He did reside in Arlington Heights, but right across the street from that address is Prospect Heights. Remember, we highlighted that Prospect Heights had 4 of those crimes. This is basically an address that's really far out of Arlington Heights, but close to Prospect Heights. This is a couple of his mugshot pictures. I like to track people to see if that particular prison has good food or bad food. He was significantly skinnier when he was let go. So it's just a couple of news articles here. Again, this one's wrong. This should be robbery. They oftentimes get these terms incorrectly used. So that is my contact information. If anybody needs it, I'll be happy to take any questions. Again, if any of you work with your police department, or any of you work for cities or counties that work with police departments often? Nobody? Go say hello. They're happy to meet you guys. Good connections to have, right? Question? Yeah.
I just had a quick. You on? Whatever. I just had a quick question. I was wondering how long this whole process took. I'm thinking of how many crimes are committed every day. Are there specific crimes you use this process for?
This process?
I'm assuming you can't do it for every single crime, obviously. So, but you've done a lot.
Requires that we've identified it in the same.
Got it.
Right
Okay.
now, for example, in Arlington Heights, we could have 4 different groups doing car burglaries.
Got it.
I can't say we're going to have a car burglary in this area by these people that they. I don't know who's doing all.
Okay.
We have to identify and isolate that person as the individual that's doing this series of crimes.
So it's more for an individual or group who's doing a much larger number of crimes.
Yeah.
It's not that one.
It doesn't have to be.
I got bored and I decided to rob a place once. Okay.
We have to isolate them.
Okay.
Doing it. I just recently did one with as low as 5.
Okay.
He committed 5 overnight burglaries to gas stations in 4 different towns, and it worked great.
Okay.
You have to identify that same person. In that particular case, we had a surveillance video at the gas station.
And I guess, how long did that for this specific,
This process took quite some time.
okay,
It wasn't until we were able to get one of the gas stations, or two of the gas stations, very early on, had audio, where we heard that
okay,
Polish or Russian accent. We said, this could be the same guy. And we started to go backwards.
okay,
Maybe this was also him.
okay.